So the Good Party is demanding an explanation from Cape Town Mayor Geordin after a law enforcement officer allegedly shot and killed a homeless person. The officer was responding to a complaint that homeless people were cooking a meal in Rondebosch when a scuffle broke out. The Good Party says officers are under-trained vigilantes. Secretary General of the Good Party and Provincial Legislature member Brett Herron joins us for more on the story now. And Brett, just on the face of it, good morning, welcome to the program. It's an incredibly bizarre and disturbing story. Let's begin with what you know as the Good Party.
Good morning, Michelle. I mean, I was alerted yesterday by residents who obviously witnessed the event and who described the homeless community as really a part of their own formal community. And what I understand was that there was a complaint about a fire that was made. The fire was a small fire on which there was a pot of food that was being cooked. So the pot was resting on some stones and there was a fire. And the law enforcement responded to this complaint, went out there and instructed the homeless people to put the fire out. The homeless man who was cooking his food objected, and a scuffle broke out, and as I understand it, the homeless man was shot in the face and died on the scene. So it is a horrendous story, but it is maybe not so unsurprising for those of us who live in Cape Town and who follow the manner in which the city responds to complaints around homelessness. And this is an escalation, I think, of a culture of hostility that exists in Cape Town at the moment.
There's also this detail, Brett. The officer involved is a City of Cape Town law enforcement officer, not a member of the SAPS.
Well, that's true. It was the City of Cape Town law enforcement. Now, this is the second incident in recent months where a law enforcement officer has used his or her firearm. In November, so 2 months ago, a law enforcement officer was convicted of murder for shooting and killing an undercover SAPS officer in Long Street earlier in the year. The big worry that I have is that these law enforcement officers are undertrained when it comes to both their training and their firearm training, and that leads to what happened perhaps on Sunday, where an altercation around whether food could be cooked on an open fire or not resulted in a firearm being discharged. Properly trained law enforcement officers would know how to deal with that kind of dispute or altercation without needing to draw a firearm.
So let's talk about the issue of training, Brett, because these law enforcement officers, as far as the information that I have in front of me is concerned, they receive 6 weeks of training. They're deployed after 6 weeks of training, compared to an SAPS learner constable who's deployed after 12 months of academic training and then another 12 months as a learner constable. So these 1,000 law enforcement officers that are part of the Western Cape's safety plan, who are they? You know, where are they from? What's their background? And how does 6 weeks of training, and I understand 3 weeks of firearms training, get you on the streets armed and clearly not able to deal with certain situations?
So let me start by saying that we don't know yet whether the law enforcement officer involved in this incident on Sunday was part of the Western Cape Safety Plan and the City of Cape Town's LEAP plan, as they call it, Law Enforcement Advancement Plan. But that Western Cape Safety Plan has as its objective to halve the murder rate in the 10 most dangerous policing precincts in Cape Town. And the plan deploys 1,000 extra officers onto the street. Those officers are learner law enforcement officers who've undergone 6 weeks training and only 3 weeks firearm training. And then they're put on the streets with firearms as learner law enforcement officers, expected to prevent violent crime in very dangerous communities. So I mean, the amount of training is obviously not enough. The program is putting young people who are stepping forward to be learner law enforcement officers, their own lives in danger. And now if this officer that responded to this fire complaint in Rondebosch was one of those 6 weeks trained young officers, his whole life is probably ruined by accepting an offer of a job, being undertrained and underprepared for a minor altercation probably. So there is a massive problem with this program, and I've been raising this concern for over a year, that these learner law enforcement officers are undertrained, armed, and are not prepared really for the circumstances and the kinds of crimes that they face. But cooking a pot of food should never result in a firearm being pulled, and that, for me, points directly to undertraining.
Yeah, surely it cannot cost you your life. Perhaps the statement from the City of Cape Town's J.P. Smith gives us a sense of who this officer is, because we've also been trying to speak to the City of Cape Town. We've got a statement here from J.P. Smith who says because there is a criminal investigation underway, their attorneys are advising them to issue a particular statement because they don't want to prejudice the officer's case. But the statement from J.P. Smith says the City of Cape Town can confirm a shooting incident involving a law enforcement officer. The matter is being investigated by the SAPS. The statement goes on, but it also says, we note some irresponsible statements speculating on the matter, which are not only defamatory but also inaccurate, and that those who respect the rule of law should allow it to take its course and allow the facts to be determined. So a lot to take from the statement that J.P. Smith sent our producers here on the AM report. But given what he says about the matter being investigated by the SAPS and confirming that it is a law enforcement officer involved, that answers the question we've been asking.
Well, it doesn't really answer the bigger question. So I think that the City of Cape Town, its mayor or its MACO member, can actually respond to the bigger question around the amount of training law enforcement officers receive, whether it is really adequate, whether they should be armed with firearms, whether they should be engaged in crime fighting in that kind of manner, and if the training is sufficient. So, you know, I think that when it suits the City of Cape Town, they hide behind apparent legal advice. I don't see that they are unable to answer questions around whether they're law enforcement officers and their learner law enforcement officers who are on the streets with firearms after 6 weeks of training at their internal academy, whether that is sufficient. So I think that we, as the people who live in Cape Town, have a right to know that when we come across a uniformed officer and they happen to be employed by the City of Cape Town, that our lives are not in danger because they are undertrained.
Absolutely. And perhaps if J.P. Smith and the City of Cape Town is watching this interview, they can avail themselves to come onto the program and answer the very questions that you've just put forward, particularly insofar as the training of these officers is concerned. Brett, you mentioned this earlier in a comment that you made, but the treatment of homeless people by officials in the City of Cape Town, once again, this puts it under the spotlight.
It does, and correctly so, because there's been an escalation of hostility and an escalation of defiance of court orders by this administration. It doesn't matter how many courts have told the City of Cape Town that they may not confiscate homeless people's possessions, they may not take the law into their own hands. They continue to do so. So there are several court cases before the Western Cape High Court. There have been judgments already. All of those have been ignored. So we have a rather defiant government, which is ironic considering that they're now referring to the rule of law and we should respect the rule of law. But there is a hostility in Cape Town towards homeless people. And this escalation is in that context and in that culture is not surprising. So what we need really from our City of Cape Town government is an appropriate solution for homelessness and not a law enforcement solution for homelessness, because we will never solve homelessness by confiscating homeless people's possessions, breaking down their shelters, trying to force them to move on. without providing them with alternative accommodation and programs to move off the streets. So there is a culture of hostility, and this escalation, I think, highlights where that culture can ultimately end up, which is an extremely unfortunate event that leads to the loss of life of one innocent man so far.
Yeah, over cooking a pot of food. Brett Herron, let me thank you for your time this morning on this horrific story. And certainly, if you are a resident in Cape Town, you deserve to know who these City of Cape Town law enforcement officers are, what kind of training they've received once they are put onto the streets and are armed, as was the case that unfolded there in Rondebosch. A homeless man cooking a meal outdoors, scuffle ensuing there, and the homeless man shot in the face. That's a big developing story that we're keeping our eyes on for you here on the AM Report.